Dr Neil Mcbride is from De Montfort University. Dr Mcbride is reader in IT management, and his research ranges quite widely on questions in various areas around sort of the ethics and management of technology, including the ethics of new tech, and questions about regulation in these kinds of spaces. He's going to speak to us today on a talk entitled, I quote, "Establishing a Framework for Augmented Reality Ethics." So thank you very much for coming to share your ideas with us today, Neil. Please take it away.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we can see your screen.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
I'm going to unshare because I failed to share the sound. So I've now shared the sound. So we get the sound from the computer, we hope.
Wonderful.
So let's get going. Let me wake up. So I called this Establishing a Framework for Augmented Reality Ethics. And my agenda, is first I want to say something about the characteristics of augmented reality. And then want to pick two case studies to say, okay, where are we at with AR ethics at the moment? I then want to propose that we look at augmented reality ethics as an ecosystem based on some work a colleague or ex-colleague, Bernd Stahl, now at the University of Nottingham, was doing. And then moving really onto sort of research, because you try and use these type of situations as chances to actually try out new ideas, to try and find a way forward practically to treat AR ethics as an ecosystem. I've got two use cases. We may not get to the second one, and I end up by making some suggestions of directions for where we need to think about guidelines anyway. This Microsoft structure for talks forced me to do an introduction. So I think to develop an ethics of augmented reality, you need to take a systemic view, developing an understanding of the organizational and technical assemblages, boundaries, and worldviews, and to integrate that with an understanding of the perceptual apparatus of augmented reality, the neuroscience, the use cases, and the ethical responsibilities associated with the manipulation of perception. So I want to say some things about augmented reality. I think augmented reality is about layering on images, on top of images, and we'll come back to that. One of the things I think is important is that augmented reality is about simplifying. The whole key issue is about focusing attention or shifting attention. I think one thing also to be considered is differentiating between virtual reality and augmented reality. When you look at some of the ethics and the papers, they tend to get a bit confused. But in a sense, it's in virtual reality, the value of virtual reality is not that it's realistic, but it's not realistic. So, for example, using VR to help autistic children, the idea is that you simplify the sensory material coming in by putting a VR set on the child so that what they're having to deal with is simplified, it's not overwhelming. It's also about interpretation. The AR interprets the environment. So the layering is layering on interpretations of what's important, what the environment is like, and so on. Excuse me. I think the important thing about AR that differentiates it from VR is that it integrates the physical and the digital. It's about needing embodiment. You cannot have AR without embodiment, without physical connection with the person, and with taking that into account in a way that perhaps with VR is not necessarily so. So you can put, there's a prevalence of space. AR is located in physical space and depends on feedback from the physical space. AR has the human in the loop. Now, the thing is there, I think that you can just you know, if you've just got, say, VR, you can just be putting the person in front of a screen and putting them into a different world. But with AR, you do need feedback all the time because you're connecting with the actual physical world that they're moving in. It's a focus on communication interface. And critically, as you all know better than I do, on perception. One thing it does is it integrates into a technological ecosystem. AR won't stand on its own. It will have to depend on databases, on accessing big data, on Internet of Things, and additionally on AI. I don't think it's something that we can just sort of separate and isolate in a box. Also, significantly, I think AR focuses on a wider language of the visual, the shapes, the meaning of images. Whereas if we look at sort of current AI and large language models, that is all about language. It's about words and patterns of words. I think it's neither augmented nor is it real. AR needs, I would suggest, a controlled and simplified landscape. So if AR is working, it will break down, it has to break down the landscape that it is looking at and interpreting and layering on into simplified patterns, blocks, and so on. So the landscape may be interpreted as buildings, identifying logos, identifying particular shapes. That simplification and selection from a landscape is rather like drawing. I've been attempting to do some drawing in my holidays, and drawing is about identifying the outline of things. It's not about a realistic representation. It's about breaking down things into lines, spaces, and geometries. The process, so, is not one of extending reality, but actually of simplifying it and distilling it. You are shaping, you are extracting shapes, and you are removing complexities because you're focusing the human's attention on what you want them to focus on a particular interpretation, a particular image, a particular part of the landscape that they're moving in. In a sense, I think it's totalizing the landscape. It's taking control of the landscape, extracting images, and in a sense, dictating what the nature and structure of the landscape that is going to layer over images, interpretations is. And it's selecting particular objects from a landscape. It occurs to me that AR, and we've seen some applications of AR within cityscapes, where there's structure, where it's geometrically structured, where it can be broken down. Maybe it would be more difficult to put AR in a rural landscape. We're in the middle of fields and forests, and you're trying to overlay something there. So there's a simplification. It's a case of simplified, isolated objects so the objects are simplified, right? And you're putting it on a location that you're managing. And I think this requires what I suggest is an asymmetry of reality. If the reality that you're imposing on the landscape that your AR user is looking at is of the same realism, the same detail, then it's likely to disappear. AR requires that there is an asymmetry, that the focus of your human user is drawn somewhere because there's a difference between that and the landscape out there that they are looking at. This asymmetry, I suggest, is really important because it also has a power aspect over it. That if there's asymmetry, the person who the organization say that is bringing in an interpretation that is imposing the image has more power to influence, and therefore also more power to direct attention. I'd like to look briefly at a couple of examples of where ethics is in terms of AR. This is an EU project called Tech Ethos, which is recently finished with, I don't know how many, at least 12 partners across Europe, looking at the ethics of new and emerging technologies, which included neuroscience, but also included XR technologies, VR and AR. Now, it was driven by two things, really. Firstly, the concept of ethics by design. And ethics by design is an attempt or a direction of trying to design the ethics in right from the start of the initial thought of developing the technology. And there's a lot of movement towards that. I've recently written something on AirTags where Apple did not do ethics by design. They suddenly realized that stalkers are using them. If they'd had ethics by design and been trying to design the ethics in, they might have actually spotted that, one hopes. And it's also a human rights approach. Where do we get the ethics down? We put it on the foundations of people's human rights. So ethics by design, intentional embedding of ethics and human use principles into the whole, that should be development and delivery life cycle. What you're trying to avoid is something called the Coleridge dilemma. That's where you miss out some ethical issue. And by the time it emerges and you face it, it's too late because the technology's out there, it's matured, and you can't backtrack. So to avoid that, you're trying to embed ethics into day-to-day work of all your design, your development employees. This is what they came up with as the output of their project, a set of values. I'm not going to go into them in detail. Note the presence of power, note transparency in their values. So there's a set of values, and out of those, there's a set of guidelines. I must admit, these guidelines are to some extent a bit obvious, considering it's a sort of £4.5 million project. But this is obviously aimed at guidelines for the EU, looking at promoting fundamental rights and encouraging ethics by design. Now, looking at the GDPR, and I think there are issues there. So the GDPR defines quite clearly, as I understand it, I'm not a lawyer or an expert on this, I need to do more work on it, what is personal data. And what this is saying, because it looked at biometrics, it looked at brain-computer interfaces and so on, that biometric data shouldn't be something special. It should be protected in the same way as your name, address, date of birth, passport numbers are protected. I'd like to suggest that there's a hole there concerning AR, because if I look at my identity is not just my name, address. My identity is my living environment, where I live, the spaces and the time I live in. So if I've got some data out there, this image data that shows me trying out something in my living room, that should get the same protection as my date of birth, my bank accounts do. Yes, looking to stop harmful online contact, etc., etc. Now, another approach is the code of ethics approach. And Eric Ramenet, who's spoken to us already, has a paper on this. But there are issues with this, right? I've seen it, it's been done by the ACM and the IEEE for computing. And the problem is, partly it's defined by the industrial and academic networks within professional societies. Yet it has weak impacts. If you try and do a study of the impact of the ACM computer ethics guidelines for IT professionals, it's really difficult to find where it's actually used, because it's non-enforceable, and also it's non-specific. It's general guidelines about, you should present your code to people so they can see it, that type of stuff. So it's non-enforceable and it's non-specific. What you find is this is overwritten by corporate culture. So the programmers at Volkswagen knew well enough what the code of ethics is, but they still put in trick code to fiddle the environmental aspects. The coders at Boeing knew what they were doing. So with the 787s, was it, that crashed because of the failure of a detector on the front of them. The point is there that it's often overridden by corporate culture. The culture at Volkswagen, for example, very strong, overrides. So you then get a view of public good versus corporate goals. And if we have these codes of ethics for our programmers, their influence is very limited. Do is complain, whistle blow, or leave the company. So one thing I think is that the danger is you isolate technology outside the client and the client usage. And I'll try and come back to that if I've got time. Here is Ramu's code of ethics. So there's some really good points here, but there's issues around, who's going to take any notice of it? How do you make it stick, really? So I'm not going to go into details. Have a look at this, clearly addressing kids and their use, incorporating, stopping people using it too much. This nudge one is actually important, actually. So I'd like to suggest that AR and its ethics sit in a complex ecosystem. That is an ecosystem of companies, users, government, states, and technologies. And all of these are connected within networks with connections, hubs of activity, flows, and so on. There's interdependencies there, and there's changing boundaries. The boundaries are not necessarily, well, they're not fixed in concrete, but they tend to change. They're also permeable. So there's issues there. And what you have in a complex ecosystem is a network of relationships. There's communication, there's interaction between states, authorities, and governments, and so on. We see that in the news every day, even with the sort of Nigel Farage thing today, with other issues where you see this interaction between various regulatory bodies, the companies, the government, the individuals, and so on. So we're looking at something that is really complex and multidimensional and contains interaction and relationships. The question I asked myself was, how do we start to interpret this and create some structure which enable us to, in a practical way, identify and get things to happen in terms of looking at technology ethics? And in this case, we'll look at a couple of examples of AR ethics. But what I've come up with is looking at some concepts from a guy called Deleuze, who, with Guattari, he wrote 1,000 Plateaus, a book that looks at some cultural aspects. And they looked a lot at certain things. I can't even, I've got my screen's got a bar across the top, but there's a quote that identifies that one important aspect is the spatial aspect. So I thought, what can we draw from them? There's three concepts that I'm still looking at in more detail in my research. The first is the concept of an assemblage of things linking together to form a grouping of elements. So this could be a technology, it could be a company. It's a gathering of things together to form a set of relationships that a set of relations which form some kind of concrete element, some agency. And it's defined by what it can do, how it operates, what its consequence is, what its implications are, and what its limits are. And we can see that as a collective. That doesn't necessarily have to be an organization like Apple. It can be a philosophical view. It can be the technology itself. And I want to go down the line of Actor Network, where Latour gives the technology equal level as the social groupings. But what's important in assemblage is those relationships and the in-between the relationships. The second idea I'd like to suggest is something called territorialization. And the idea of that is your assemblage, whether it's Apple or something, it occupies a space in the ecosystem. So it's actually taking territory that's not necessarily physical. It can be ideas, theories, it can be views of what the technology does, views of what's right and wrong, and so on. And the idea of territorialization is that by taking territory, you result in new behaviors, expressions, new actors, and new realities. One idea that Deleuze develops is an idea of deterritorializing and re-territorializing. And I think this has some relevance to AR. So what with AR, you've got the person looking at this old built, this set of flats, and you want to deterritorialize that by overlaying a picture of how it was when it was a factory in Victorian times, and then you're re-territorializing. The third element that I think is important, and I think that needs really in technology ethics, not just AR ethics, to be think about is the event. What is the event that is changing how people see things, that is driving, that is identifying ethical problems that need to be tackled? Now, those events can be in the large, or they can be somebody just putting on a screen, the viewer and actually viewing something is an event. But I think that it could be worth looking at driving consideration of ethics through the events and how that develops the ethics. We see with the arrival of ChatGPT, it's a massive event that suddenly shifted ethics and debate substantially. Why am I not? Got it. So I won't go into these in details because I want to move on to the examples and make things hopefully a little bit clearer. There's a couple of ideas that can be explored. There's the idea of an abstract machine, and your issues are not what, why, and how, but how, where in spatial terms is this occurring, and when, and who is the agency. There's identifying what the concrete elements are and what they can do. And there's looking at the idea of a persona. And I draw out of this the idea that assemblages will have various worldviews. So it's how do they see what's important? How do they see the ethics and the value of AR, for example? I'm going to skip that. So there's two examples I want to look at. So the first one is neuromarketing. Now, a lot of the potential of AI is seen in marketing, in brand identification, and so on. So some experiments have been done by a commercial company looking at smartphone users and identifying how they interact with AR versions and what is going on in the brain, to try and look at what is the best way of using AR in terms of advertising, in terms of brands, using a fairly sort of basic brain imaging with a skull cap with 64 electrodes, but you can get a map of how people respond, how the brain is responding to an AR environment. So they did it on all these three, where they contrast something really exciting with a very boring browsing on the website. And they came up with some key themes. I've quoted these as text to be considered and deconstructed, perhaps, from Mindshare, who carried out the work. So there was an advertising company, there was a client, and then there was Mindshare doing the research work. So the key themes that they came up with was that initially you can see that AR is much more effective in focusing attention. You can see parts of the brain light up than your normal just going to the website. So there is this activity in the brain that gets a focus, right, that is changing things. And that, I think, is around the way it gets attention. So they talk about from surprise to delight in everyday utility. So getting people within their everyday lives to identify a brand and be surprised by it. Layering additional layers of content. They have this concept of you're layering content, you're layering your brand content on top of what the user is doing. This I found a bit alarming, the concept of surfacing. AI will increasingly enable personalized contextual content to be organically surfaced without the user initiating it. Flowing will be a key tool for assisting and helping. So there's this trying to embed it in people's everyday lives, which is a Latour concept by which you get things so that they become embedded in life. I've forgotten the word for it, it'll come back to me. But the novelty is going to wear off. And what the advertising agencies are suggesting is that augmented reality should become part of long-term brand strategies. And therefore, your AR becomes not something, you know, oh, it's exciting and new to have these butterflies flying around in front of my face, but rather it partly embedded in strategy and in the narrative. So what I'm suggesting is that, you know, in long terms, looking at AR ethics, we have to ask questions of, say, marketing companies. What is the narrative? What are you getting across? How is AR influencing that? Hang on. Sorry. I've got screen sharing going on above me, so I cannot actually click on what I want to click on here. So I'm going to come out of that. My fault for putting it in the wrong place.
You might, if it's opening it in a new window, Neil, you might want to stop sharing your screen and then reshare with the window that's showing the YouTube video, I think.
Okay, well, I've managed to extract it. You hear this?
We can hear it, but we can't see it.
Oh, great.
So stop sharing your screen just for a second. And
Done.
now share again with the web browser that's got YouTube in it.
Oh, right, of course.
Make sure you click the button that says share sound as well when you go into that.
Right, I've got that clicked. Right, okay. Yes, I've got it. I see what we should be doing.
Fantastic.
Okay, go to the start.
Take it away.
Take it away indeed. Here we go. Okay, well, sorry, that didn't quite work, but I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to go back to my slides, where they got to. I'm going to share those and off we go again. And go from the current slide.
Good.
So that was an example of AR being used in a campaign for a sort of major fashion house setting up their Paris retail center. And therefore, trying to understand its complexity I've tried to list some of the assemblages, the territories, and the events that are affecting, well, not affecting, that all have some ethical aspect to them. So this is just a list from looking at the campaign marketing and so on. So we've got the, very briefly, the New York fashion house, Zappar, who do the technology, I think, Mindshare World, the brand the consultancy for brands, the model agency, the city of Paris itself. And if we could have watched it a bit slower, there's various companies who are sharing in the AR attention seeking, attention directing, really. So there's a bakery, you go in and the cakes come out. There's actually a library selling old books. There's the Eiffel Tower itself. Then there's the actual application, which is called My Little Paris Tablets. There's assemblages, Apple with the phone, Instagram and Twitter with, this is their, the Twitter hashtag. There's influencers on Instagram and elsewhere. I have no idea where they influence. And there's the campaign magazine itself. All of those are assemblages, they're players in this complex ecosystem where ethical issues will arise, if you like. There's then just the territory. So obviously there's Paris itself, moving across Paris, and specific parts of Paris have been identified as places. So the user is led through a sort of tour of Paris through the AR. There's obviously high-end fashion. There's the mobile technology and influencing, sort of territorializing that. And there's Instagram and the other social media sites. We then have the events. And the main event that's driving this is the opening of Kate Spade's store in Paris. But clearly, every individual customer's event is also something that may have ethical issues underpinning it. I'm not going to go with the second video. Do have a look yourself. So this is a different example, right? In this example, a lady undergoes spine surgery where augmented reality is used. So having used MRI to get 3D pictures of the spine, then the surgeon has that has an AR set from Augmedics on his head, and that enables him to see the AR image at the same time as working out where to put the screw in, you know, which is obviously a very needs very much care. So the assemblage can be just a person who has an ethical review and maybe thinks influencing things. So there's a Dr. Timothy Whittam. The patient signs the consent form. So the consent form, the AR is embedded, the doctor says we're going to use AR, but that's, the patient says, well, anything, I accept what you say, doctor. So there's some responsibility there. The Johns Hopkins Medical Center financing this, 2 independent radiologists. Now, the independent radiologists were looking at whether this was a valid surgical technique. So before they actually used it live, they got dead people basically, and they did a lot of surgical tests to show that they could put the screw in the right place. And they had 2 independent neuroradiologists to confirm, yes, this is working. There's the AR headset itself, which is an assemblage, and the company Augmedics that provide it. In terms of territories, there's not just the operating theatre, the spine, the medical centre, there's the finance who are deciding, are we going to finance this? What cost does it have on the operation and so on? There's the professional education of the surgeons. There's also, in this case, a territory is the Journal of Neurosurgery. So occupying that territory to say by journal publication that this is a valid surgical technique. Events, well, there's probably more than I could find that in this. The tests on the cadavers, the publication in the journal, the consent signing by the patient, and the commencing of the operation. So there's a whole sort of events that have ethical consequence, and where ethical issues may emerge, and where we may have to consider the complexity of how we deal with that. Here's just a couple of quotes. It's the type of headset fighter pilots commonly used. There's also a computer onlay, shows us also the internal structure of the bone in 2 planes. So you can attend to the patient and view the computerized images at the same time. When using augmented reality in the operating room, it's like having GPS navigator in front of your eyes in a natural way, so you don't have to look at a separate screen to see your patient's CT scan. So there's all these views of how it works, why it is important. So you see there's lots of assemblages, each one having its worldview, each one influencing the others in various ways. So having tried to think about the complexity of the ecosystem in which AR operates, having tried to work out how can we begin to map this, begin to understand it, begin to investigate and therefore identify ethical issues, the thing comes down to our next task, which is where do we put, or what do we suggest in guidelines, where do we go? So I'd like to suggest some possible directions or ideas that maybe we need to be thinking about. So first is the extension of identity into space and time. I think that identity is important. We identify ourselves by some data characteristics, by who we are, by relationship, by place, and by space and time, I guess. The extension of the personal information data set towards the type of data that is being accessed and used within AR. Identifying explicit intention and intervention. So what is the explicit intention in our Kate Spade example and in the Johns Hopkins Medical Center example? What is the intention and what are the ethics of that intention, and where are those ethics located? So the ethics in the medical example would be located right back into the ethics of the surgeon, the surgical practice, the professional ethics. Considering an event-based ethic, can we identify the nature of the events where AR is being used and ask ethical questions of them? I think one of the things that's key about AR is that, as I tried to suggest, it's neither augmented or real. It's about focus on object, on purpose, on attention. The whole point, I think, of AR is to direct attention to a particular idea, a particular image, a particular object, a particular aspect of the landscape. How do we look at the ethics of image?
I'm sorry to sort of interject here, but I'd be grateful if you could start wrapping things up so we don't eat into your question session too much.
Yeah, this is, I hope this is the last slide. So I hope I'm nearly there. Sorry, I've overrun a couple of minutes. Okay, so image asymmetry. So there has to be, there can't be equal images. So by differentiating, there's, I think, I'm not sure how this works, this power comes into it. What is the extent and reach of the territory? Where are the boundaries? What is in and what is out? How do we perhaps even need to register a target landscape? That's bringing us back to issues of the law if you're putting images on somebody else's building or whatever. So there is, how do we bound the landscape? Do we register it? How do we define it? How do they define in Paris what was valid for that brand setting tour of Paris? What are the sources, the authorship responsibility for the imposed image? I'm suggesting the image, it could be a photo of a person who comes and stands in and starts narrating what's going on as you move around. Or it could be drawn little pieces of cake going around. Who is responsible for that image and its imposition on the perception of the user? Another thing, how do we declare, and I think this is something we need to be aware of, the automation of the system and the integration with big data, with AI systems that may be taking feedback back from what is appearing on the landscape image that the person is viewing, and making decisions on that, on what to show. So there has to be some AI basically doing image analysis as the person looks at that baking shop, identifying where the door is, and then imposing on that the door's opening and those pieces of cake coming out. So at the heart of AI is image analysis, and being able to look at many, many patterns. So we can't actually disconnect AI as if it's sort of some isolated ethics. Summary, those were just some things, and that's it. Thanks for listening. So I will stop sharing.
Splendid. Thank you very much, Neil, for that very interesting talk. Sorry, do a little bit of clapping. Okay, folks, we have around sort of just a little over 10 minutes for questions. Please pop me a cue in the in the private chat if you'd like to ask anything. Neil, I was wondering if I could kick off, if that's okay. Thank you for the sort of that very rich tour. I wanted to go back to what you said about ethics by design. Because I thought that struck me as being quite useful for this discussion, but a little bit underspecified. I mean, in particular, the idea of having ethics present in the design process right from the start might sound like it's not something which we should set up in opposition to having guidelines. It's just a question of when the guidelines come in and we give them to kind of designers right at the beginning. Now, the way that you were talking about Professor Ramirez's approach made it sound as though you think ethics by design is not that. It's not just a matter of giving the guidelines earlier on. But I wondered then if you could talk about what it would actually mean to embed ethics at that earlier stage.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the main way you design systems now is an agile design, where you've got you define a story, like the user is going to pass the bakery, and then you develop the code for that story. The idea is that in that initial stage, you're saying, okay, is there an issue? Is there any ethical issues I should think about there? So you're then embedding, you're not just saying, what often happens is you produce the system and you then look and say, was there any ethical issues? No, it's fine. This is saying that your developers, but also your product owners, your brand managers, etc., are all aware of ethical possibilities right from the start, and you're designing in, right, we'll make sure it's the right door, or if somebody comes through that door, we will close the door. So what if, do you see what I mean? Does that make any sense?
So it's not so much I mean, the guidelines focused approach would be to say, here's a set of injunctions that you have to obey. And the way that you're describing it is, you think, well, look, let's give you a list of things which are ethically salient that we want you to attend to, that are going to be part of the life cycle of the use of this technology, and then try to get people to imaginatively engage with those as they're going through, but where those emerge from the imagined use of it rather than an attempt to take these high-level injunctions and apply them. Is that right?
Yeah, it's partly also in calculating in the designers and the teams and so on, something about ethical awareness, so that it's not, I'm programming it, I don't care what it's done, that you're getting them to be reflexive, to anticipate, to think, how would this affect me? How do I think about this? And it's not just, I want to write some great code or get this robot to do A, B, and C.
Okay, I see. So it's partly about education in that case.
Yeah.
So habituation. Good. Lovely. Okay, so next question is from Nathan.
Cool. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Excellent. So yeah, thank you for that. That was really interesting. I was very struck by a claim you made in a couple different times, a couple different ways, about kind of simplification that's involved in AR. So you said something like, AR always involves a simplification of what it's depicting or something along these lines. And then later on, you talked about how it's always designed to direct attention at some particular thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't think either of those are true.
Mm-hmm.
If we think about many uses of, well, relatively recent AR, you have basically kind of pass-through stuff where it's trying to effectively like get you to the real world, often with things that are overlaid that are meant to look as realistic as possible. And in that case, there's no real simplification endeavors at all, right? It's basically meant to be like you're literally just looking at the world and there's some extra stuff in the world that's out there too. And those kinds of cases would also be counterexamples to the like it's always meant to direct your attention at some particular thing. It's getting you to view the world, and these kinds of cases you're viewing the real world and then there are some additional bits on it. So I'm wondering about what you think is going wrong in those cases, or do you just kind of dismiss them? Do you say they're not AR? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does. Well, I mean, that's what is the purpose of the additional bits? So if the additional bits are overwhelming the landscape, then the landscape disappears in a sense. So I think that in any case there is, you're putting additional bits because you want somebody to think in a different way or identify something about the landscape that they weren't going to otherwise. In doing that, you are inevitably directing their attention to something. So unless you overlaid, say, I don't know, you're in the middle of a city and you overlaid a sort of picture of a woodland and streams so they couldn't see the city, you then invalidate the whole thing and they walk straight into a building or something. So you're taking the landscape and you are overlaying with something. Therefore, you are directing attention. You're trying to simplify the complexity of the landscape and say, forget there's all of these buildings and there's pigeons up there. Just think about this bit here or this bit here. So I think that there is a state that, what is the purpose of AR? It's to do with helping attention on a particular thing. So in the terms of the surgeon, for example, the overlaying was enabling to line up the MRI images and get his attention right down to a point. In the point of the branding, where they could have used photos of little bits of cake, but in the cake and the flamingo, it's to give some impression and to get some kind of attention there. So the issue, I think, with AR is that I may be completely wrong, but that it's about, in a sense, saying, okay, you've got this massive environment. We all simplify environments because that's what, when you drive, you simplify your environment, don't you? So that you're looking at sort of particular patterns on the road, but if a fox goes out, you'll see it. So, we do that in anyway, but AR is doing that type of thing. So saying, we put the fox there, but it's somebody else, the brand managers, the marketing, the neuroscientists or whatever, who are deciding what actually is the focus. So in that sense, it is simplifying the complexity of the world we walk through.
I would guess, I mean, maybe this depends on what you want to mean by simplify, but I would think it's complicating things more by adding additional details or perhaps drawing out particular details of things. But that's by the by. I guess what kind of coming through that, it sounds to me like the kind of direct attention claim actually either turns out to be a really minimal one, which is just like, hey, it's sort of saying, let's look at some stuff and don't look at these things, look at these things, which is fairly mundane. And then I guess, sure, but then it's not a substantive claim. Or it's a very heavy duty one, like you were talking about with the surgery case. And that seems to be a very particular kind of AR. So I'm wondering then about extending it out in any substantive way. But I worry maybe this is just some kind of verbal disagreement that we're having. So
Well, I think it's something I need to think about, certainly. Yeah.
Thank you, folks. I think in the interests of keeping things to time, I'm going to wrap up the discussion there, if that's okay. So I think it remains for us to thank Neil again for a very interesting presentation. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.